Hi, Jack. Welcome to the Oslo Freedom Forum.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I'll just jump right in. It would have been great if we had had this conversation in Norway proper, but we'll do the best we can. So,
And we'll do it again as well.
oh, excellent, excellent. So this way you can meet some of the very activists that, because of Twitter, have a voice. Twitter is such a positive tool for pro-democracy activists that are under authoritarian regimes, regimes where freedom of expression does not exist, regimes where there is no equivalent of a public square, where censorship and repression allow a stifling of all kinds of political speech. And Twitter has changed all this. Twitter has essentially permitted people who otherwise would not have had a voice to open up a national conversation in places where, sometimes they do it in their own name, sometimes it's pseudonymous, sometimes it's anonymous. It is truly an awesome responsibility that Twitter has allowed this to occur, that this exists. Now, we are very critical of Twitter sometimes. People, they pile on Twitter, but we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. And again, I stress the awesome responsibility of carrying the world's conversation is something that is definitely worthy of admiration. Now, what do we not know? What's it like on the inside?
Well, I think one of the most beautiful things about Twitter is that we have created it with the people that are using it every step along the way from the very beginning. We started with a very simple idea, which is something we wanted to see and we wanted to use in the world. But as we gave it out to more and more people, they made it their own. And that started with the @ symbol. It is something that we did not invent, something like the hashtag, another thing we did not invent. The retweet, the ability to spread it to your followers. We did not invent the tweet storm, and the thread all came from the people using it as well. So inside the company, where I think our strength is we are able to observe very well. We're able to take critical feedback. We're able to see some of the patterns that emerge and then make them accessible to more and more people. So inside the company, you have a bunch of very empathetic people. You have people who are really good observers who want frank, critical feedback because we know we're not building this for us anymore. We know we're building it for all these people that we serve. And I think after some of the tech early adopters, the first major constituencies to join the platform were journalists and activists. And every major constituency that joins in mass adds a new dimension to the service that we weren't expecting. We weren't expecting activists to use it. We weren't planning for it. And they had very different needs than we were originally imagining. Pseudonymity became very important. The ability to follow accounts became very important. The ability to DM and create communities around hashtags and watch what was trending in a particular country became very important. So these are things that, we put out and then we watched, we observed, and we made better. And that's it's true to today. I think, the biggest thing that we're wrestling with is all the new challenges that technology provides, such as misleading information and how people might be gaming the system in order to artificially amplify information or to make the conversation overall less healthy and less valuable in the end. So
If I can jump in there, the pseudonymity, you mentioned pseudonymity, and of course pseudonymity is essential for some of these activists who can't use their own names when telling truths about certain things in certain countries. Yet, even though pseudonymity has played a crucial role in protecting the activists in these oppressive regimes, it has also enabled authoritarian governments to manipulate the minds of millions of people by creating fake accounts, by spreading disinformation. In the case of, say, Russia in the case of Saudi Arabia. The positive influence of Twitter is countered by these vast armies of trolls who serve the governments, and they bring positive information down, negative information up, false information, people with like 0 followers who spend all day tweeting, this sort of thing, and they attack independent voices. Many times they end up drowning out the voices of independent users, and a perception is created. I mean, in the case of Saudi, for certain, in the case of Russia, that the ruler of the nation is popular, is loved, is supported. And so suddenly the hashtags in favor of MBS or in favor of Putin are way up there, and they're trending topics. Yet the truth is totally different. How can and how will Twitter reduce the reach of these unverified accounts and stop these bad actors from abusing your platform? I mean, how do you create a balance between an online public square filled with independent voices and one filled with trolls and with fake accounts?
I appreciate the difference between anonymity and pseudonymity. Anonymity feels a lot more random. Pseudonymity is built identity. And that is what we want to value, and that is what we want to protect ultimately. And we have seen attacks against that, and they have been more anonymous attempts where people are creating accounts or states are creating accounts en masse, and whether they be bot-driven or a organization of humans that have an agenda, they take on similar patterns, which is trying to game our system, specifically around trends, in order to artificially amplify information or a trend that just doesn't naturally exist, doesn't organically exist. And in the early days, we just were not prepared to recognize this or handle it, whereas today we are. We've taken a lot more action on recognized patterns, just looking not at the accounts themselves, but looking at the network between the accounts. Looking at where these accounts might come from, look at how new the accounts are and how quickly they get up to speed in terms of one particular agenda, one particular hashtag, one particular message, and then acting much faster on it. And I think it's really important, and we believe it's critical that in order, in the course of work of, identifying these networks, of artificial amplification and then actioning them, taking them down, we have to be transparent. We have to be open with what we found, what we did, and what we're looking for in the future. And each one of these comes with a risk as we disclose it, because as you disclose some of these risks, you're also showing some of the holes in your system and showing how others might be able to take advantage of it in the future. But we've gotten much better at staying steps ahead of some of these attacks. So that's one, is just looking at the network. Another is looking at the incentives of the product, looking at the product surfaces themselves, and are they still serving the original intent? Trending topics, for instance, has been an area that people have focused on, both in terms of seeing what's happening in the world and seeing what's happening within their community and their country, but also as a vector for attack and a vector to influence and shift minds. And there's certainly a lot we can do to recognize what's happening within that network, but there's a lot more we can do to make the product a lot better, to add more context, to show more of the connections, to enable people to drill down further so they can see what's really happening. And then, of course, labeling of both accounts and tweets. As we have credible information to determine whether this account might be state-owned or state-associated, whether these accounts might be new, whether they might be controlled by an API endpoint or a bot versus someone on their phone who's opening their phone with a biometric. These are all signals that we can use to make the credibility of accounts, and therefore the credibility of their information, at least much stronger, but more transparent ultimately, so that people can make decisions for themselves when they see these trends, when they see these particular accounts, and know that this message carries with it a different degree of consideration that people have to be aware of. So focusing on the network, focusing on the product surface area, making that better, and then adding context and credibility where we can determine it is how we're going after this.
It's excellent that Twitter is taking this seriously, because for some of these governments, control of the flow of information, control of propaganda, the use of disinformation and misinformation is an absolute existential subject for them. If they lose control of that, they could lose control of their country, and they're literally lose control of the government. If we take the Saudi example, they've taken it so seriously that they put spies inside the Twitter machine. They had engineers hired by Twitter who they had essentially propped up and placed there. And in 2015, Saudi agents were discovered to have infiltrated Twitter. And their goal was to get into the back end and identify to be able to identify specific people who were tweeting against the Crown Prince. When this was exposed, the message sent, literally, people on Twitter, users felt naked. They literally, it was so chilling that human rights activists and dissenters, especially from the Middle East, could be identified this way and exposed, and ultimately arrested and God knows, in some cases disappeared. What measures has Twitter taken to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again?
I think it's so from a system standpoint, everything I mentioned around strengthening our system, applying more machine learning. Years ago we had to do this in a very mechanical way, and that can be slow and it can be super lossy in terms of us just not seeing everything. But now we are applying machine learning in a much more fulsome way. We're able to see a lot more. We're able to share with our peers what we're seeing and what they're seeing, which gives us more confidence that this is an action by a particular group that is not authentic and not genuine. Whereas in the past, we probably weren't doing enough of that. And it's often the case that this is not an attack against any one system. It's an attack against many systems to make sure that people are seeing it across different products and services. I think it's really critical that we maintain a connection and collaboration with journalists, with civil society, with activists, and getting constant feedback and pointers too. Because we're looking at one particular thing, which is how the system is working and the patterns that emerge on top of it. But if we don't hear the other side, if we don't hear the questions, if we don't hear the dangers, if we don't hear the critique, we're going to miss some of the things that would be important to address and to figure out and to acknowledge. So it's really, really incredibly important that we maintain these open channels to make sure that we're seeing everything that we need to see, and when we're not, that people are holding us accountable to it and calling us out for it.
Right, but in this case, it was a social engineering hack. The Saudis put people inside Twitter. How do you stop that? How are you going to? What do you do to stop the Chinese government from doing the same thing, or any government who hires a firm that engages in a private spying agency, such as Black Cube or the people who created Pegasus out of Israel? How do you ensure that essentially the keys to that back end remain in the pockets of those who are going to protect the identity of these human rights activists?
Yeah, well, I fundamentally believe that security is not something that can ever be perfected. It's a constant race. It's a constant push to be 10 steps ahead of your attackers. And I think there are a few elements that are really important within that race. One is creating a lot of agility internally so that we can recognize flaws quickly and then fix them and advance them. Two is getting outside feedback and people who are watching from different angles and researching from different angles to actually see what's happening. And then third, making sure that we're building the right secure systems within our platform so that we can have trust in an untrusted environment. And there's a lot of newer technologies that provide for this. I mean, the whole spirit of Bitcoin, for instance, is to provide a trusted system in a distrusted environment, which is the internet. And those technologies will provide us new capabilities where we can do this internally as well, and provide a lot more peace of mind in terms of us at the company, but also the people that are using our service, that this is something that even if you have untrusted parties entering in the system as workers, as people who are using the service, that it is still secure, it's still protected. And the more of those technologies we build in, the more of the technologies that are linked to an identity and a security system that you as an individual uniquely own, the more we can use biometrics to hook that up, whether it be Face ID or Touch ID or something that we're not considering right now. The more we're giving the individual the keys, the safer this whole system is going to be. And right now, we're just not in that state, but we are working towards it. And when I say we, it's the whole industry of the internet. And you see this most fundamentally in the work in Bitcoin and blockchain. And that's what gives me a lot of hope and a lot of peace of mind to help these issues and to help thwart these issues, is because the keys and the control will actually be more and more in the hands of the individual rather than a corporation or rather than a government.
I have the idea, I mean, shifting the conversation to building the future is definitely something I want to end with. But if I can go and discuss briefly, because again, it's very important to so many people in our community to put this question to you. Look, Iran and China are countries where Twitter is banned outright. Nobody in these countries can tweet. But officials from these countries, like from China or Iran's foreign ministry, they use Twitter to express the government's point of view. So essentially, the government minister can tell the world what the position is of the government, or misinform, whether it's about COVID or about anything else. Yet the people of that country can't use it. So why are you letting them use it, and yet they ban their own people? Isn't it hypocritical to allow officials to have verified Twitter accounts to promote the propaganda of, the Iranian and Chinese regime, while they ban their own people from access to your platform?
Well, there are people in China and in Iran that are using Twitter, that are seeing what people are saying, including their leaders on Twitter. And they're doing so through safe VPNs. They have friends outside of those countries and collaborators and colleagues outside of those countries who are also watching. And I do think it's important to show the dissonance of what's happening on the ground versus what the leaders are saying, to help hold them to account and to also see what they're doing. I do believe it's important at least to have their voices in the open, so that how the story of the country, how the story of the regime or the administration is being told to the rest of the world. And that information gives a much more credible fight. It gives more information with which to utilize and to strengthen the activism around. So it does, on the surface, it does feel dissonant that we would enable that. But I do think it's important to see as many of the voices as possible, especially the ones that you disagree with, so that you can understand how they're thinking and what they're trying to say and how they're trying to represent the whole of the people to the world, when in fact that is not how it should be represented. That is not the particular case. And that context that we also provide, I think, is important for the rest of the world. We just started labeling state-controlled media or state-associated media, and it gives a context to the rest of the world that this is associated with the government, who activists might be against. And having that context and giving that information to people, gives them a different judgment on what they're reading and what the intent is, and if there's an agenda behind it.
Well, you started labeling the officials from China, Russia, but then you also added France, United Kingdom, and the U.S. You've been going into what has propelled this decision to have wider information. Are you going to adopt this worldwide? When officials from different countries, are you going to have that as announced so that people know that? And if we can take one step further, there are state propaganda vehicles, like, for instance, RT, which is very popular in the United States, and very few people realize that it is actually Putin's network. It literally is Putin's network. It puts out information that Putin wants out there, and many times it's misinformation or false information. By the same token, you have TRT out of Turkey, and you have other state-owned vehicles from dictatorships that are pushing a particular agenda, and a lot of people, it looks like the BBC, it looks like CNN, it looks like something that otherwise you might think is credible, but in the end it actually is not. RT is not credible, and yet people are disseminating it like it's a credible privately owned network subject to the same kind of standards of journalistic ethics as we have in the West. Are you going to start labeling those as well?
We are. We wanted to start small. We wanted to start with more known entities that we could learn from, test out the system, and then as we understand it and we understand both the positives and also the negatives that we're improving, we can roll it out to more and more. And I think it's important that we do that smaller test, because we'll get feedback from activists on what's working and what's not working, and that's just critical to our work. If in the past we may have moved very quickly to cover the world with that, and that would have been in error, because it may have created more confusion, because the product and the understanding of it just was not as robust as it needed to be. So I think it's really important as we take steps like this, that we take small steps and we allow them to grow, and we take in all the learnings and just try to understand as much as we can before we expand it even further. That's one of our greatest lessons over the past 5 years, is to slow down a bit, pace it, and make sure that we are doing the right thing, integrating the critical feedback. And I believe we were one of the first to ban RT from utilizing our advertising systems in order to propagate their messaging. And we are also one of the first, if not the first, to ban all political advertising on our platform as well, with the principle of political speech should be earned and not paid for. So all of these represent ideas that we think are credible after talking with people, and then as we get more understanding about them, to roll them out and to scale them and to make them much more impactful and much more accessible by more people.
Well, it's all sounds like a lot of very good things that are happening. I want to note, for some of the people that may not know this, that Twitter was one of the major global tech platforms that announced that they would be pausing when the Chinese regime had the Hong Kong national security law imposed, essentially making Hong Kong a jurisdiction of the Chinese Communist Party's legal system. They paused all data requests from the Hong Kong police. And this was, from those of us from a human rights perspective, it was such an important step of you basically counting yourself as not being a part of the legal system of the CCP. Why was this an important thing for Twitter?
It was important. It was important for us because it's true to who we are. We've had a long-standing relationship and usage with the people in Hong Kong, and we've also had a lot of experience and a track record of pushing back on governments that are egregiously going after a particular journalist or activist and fighting for them. And we have a history of doing this not just around the world, but also within our own country, in terms of making sure that we can take these actions, making sure that we can have transparency around any requests that governments around the world ask of us, and that we really that we really fight hard for the people that are on our service. And this one made sense immediately, and something that we worked with our civil societies around the world to help understand and to strengthen our moves. And we want to make sure that in any of these actions that people have awareness of why we're taking it, and some of the upside and the downside of those actions for the company, for the service, and also for the people who might be using it.
Well, it was definitely something that was noticed by everyone in the human rights field. I want to go back to what you had started discussing when it comes to blockchain and building the future. In this past December, Twitter announced that you were going to be funding a small team of 5 open source architects and engineers and designers to start developing an open and decentralized standard for social media. So the goal was ultimately to be a client of this standard. Can you explain that to people who are not techies, who are not like blockchain enthusiasts? What are the risks of an internet that is not open, and what does it mean to having a decentralized standard for social media?
There's probably a number of you who remember the older internet, Usenet, IRC, Internet Relay Chat. And what was interesting, and that's the internet I grew up on, and what was interesting is how decentralized the internet was at that time. And then what was difficult about that decentralization was actually discovery, finding content, finding people that would be like-minded. And that is what Google represents. It's centralizing the discovery problem. It's what Facebook represents, centralizing a discovery problem. It's what Twitter represents as well, centralizing the discovery problem. And now we're in a world that blockchain exists, that Bitcoin exists, that decentralized technologies exist, so that now we can build the discovery problem on a much more decentralized foundation. And what I think that does is generally a lot of our value in the past was around content hosting. So we would host the tweets, we'd host the images, we'd host the videos. Blockchain and Bitcoin point to a future and point to a world where content exists forever, where it's permanent, where it doesn't go away, where it exists forever on every single node that's connected to it. And what that means is the job of content hosting goes away. The job of discovery is the most important thing. And we've had to really consider what that means for us as a company. What that means is we're not in the content hosting business anymore. We're in the discovery business. And we're going to have a particular approach on discovery, which is healthy conversation. Healthy public conversation that seeks to help people understand what's happening in the world, to have conversations about what's happening, and hopefully solve problems together. And what that means ultimately is we need to become a client of something much bigger than us. We need to enable people to contribute to a public blockchain, and we need to be able to enable people to be able to pull and see from that public blockchain as well. And if we're able to do that, it's something that's really powerful and something that I think speaks back to the power and the original intent of what the internet could be, which is something that anyone in the world can access. Anyone in the world can make decisions around in terms of their engagement, in terms of what they own, in terms of what they see, in terms of what they share. And companies like us can build a business on top of that that contributes to that greater whole, but pulls from it in a way that's compelling to people. And we wanted to advance this, so we're going to hire 5 engineers and some folks to start building Twitter as a protocol. And one of the things we heard early on in Twitter's history is that This is so basic and so simple. It kind of feels like a protocol right now. It doesn't feel like a company. It feels more like a movement, and it feels more like a technology that I can use to build whatever I want to build on top of. And that was such a magic time and such a magic understanding of what Twitter was. And we want to get back to that, and we want to help the world get back to that as well. So right now we're in the phase of finding a leader for it, but this is a completely separate nonprofit from the company. This group will be tasked with building a protocol that we can use, but everyone else can use. And then we'll really focus on becoming a client of it so that we can build a compelling service and business on top of a much larger corpus of conversation that anyone can access and anyone can contribute to.
That's quite inspiring. Now, before I ask you one last question, I have to interrupt and ask. So in the background, I either hear a dragon or the king of the roosters, or I hear a massive parrot. What's going on? I mean, it sounds like you're in a dragon's lair.
I'm in a more rural area, and there's a very proud rooster.
Okay, it's a rooster. Okay, interesting. Okay, so we got the technology and agriculture. That's quite nice. Aviculture, I should say. So, Jamal Khashoggi, who had attended the Freedom Forum in Norway months before he was murdered because he posed an existential threat to the control that Saudi Arabia's government and the Crown Prince had over Twitter, over the Twitter conversation in that country. People are going to learn in Brian Fogel's film that he was essentially killed because of Twitter. Currently, Omar Abdulaziz, a Twitter activist who was very strong in creating a counter to the disinformation campaign of the Saudi, his brothers are currently in prison there precisely because he was able to defeat the Crown Prince's trending topics. My last question is more of a request. Would you accept an invitation from the Human Rights Foundation to join the campaign for justice for Jamal Khashoggi?
Yes, absolutely yes. Jamal represented the best of what the service is, the intersection between journalism, between activism, between speaking truth to power, to holding power to account, and to influencing change and creating a public conversation around what needs, the atrocities and what needs to change about organizations and regimes around the world. So this is really critical to us. It's really important to the world. And something we will definitely stand for.
Jack Dorsey, thank you very much. We hope to see you in Norway the next time.
Thank you so much. I look forward to meeting you all in person.
So long.